All right, y'all. Well, a very happy Friday to everybody. Today is November the November the 20th, 2020, and we're continuing on, Brother Jim, with what we had been talking about in the prior two shows, America on the Brink. This will be part 3, and I'm just going to lay it on the line here, Brother Jim.
I wish you would.
The United States of America, and I don't care what flowery term people want to throw in, is on the precipice of a communist revolution.
I agree.
There is a communist revolution taking place in the United States of America. In fact, the seeds of this were planted a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
But we're really, in our generation, seeing the seeds come to fruition to the point where the most powerful office in the United States is on the precipice and in the process of being stolen. And here is our outline that we're going to try to work through today. And let's begin with number 1, which is the global reset. You cannot understand what is happening to Donald Trump, and you cannot understand the theft of this election until you understand it from a global perspective. Mm-hmm. This issue is so much bigger than Donald Trump. And it's so much bigger than Republican versus Democrat. And it's really so much bigger than liberal versus conservative. It's globalist versus nationalist. Mm-hmm. And are we going to be pulled into this globalist experiment that people want to throw us into, and that they're using COVID-19 as a pretext for? Or is America going to continue to be unique amongst the family of nations? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, people say, oh, come on, that you're just conspiracy theorists, this is hyperbole. Well, here we have this article from Summit News, November 16th, 2020, by Paul Joseph Wilson, and the title of it is The Great Reset, Trends on Twitter After Justin Trudeau Says Corona Pandemic Has Provided an Opportunity. Some claim the World Economic Forum agenda is just a conspiracy theory. So now Trudeau, this is something I think he said back in September, if I'm not mistaken. But he very clearly, in this video, which we don't have, but we have the transcript of it, connects the dots between COVID-19 as a pretext for global reset, leading to what he calls UN 2030, United Nations Goals 2030. In other words, what he's saying, and this is the Prime Minister of Canada, we're going to use COVID-19 to push the planet in the direction of the United Nations Global Sustainable Goals. Yeah. So I don't really think it's a conspiracy anymore when they come out and tell you exactly what they're going to do. So what is this article about here from Summit News? Can you read that?
All right. The Great Reset began trending on Twitter after Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the coronavirus pandemic had provided an opportunity for a reset. Trudeau made the comments during a United Nations video conference back in September, but they are only just receiving attention. Quoting, "Building back better means getting support to the most vulnerable, while maintaining our momentum on reaching the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals," close quote, said Trudeau.
So according to Trudeau himself, COVID-19 equals global reset.
Yes.
Equals United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Mm-hmm. And here's an article from the New American, James Murphy, November 16th, 2020, and the title of it is Canada's Justin Trudeau, and I might add the words explicitly, ties COVID-19 recovery to reset and UN Agenda 2030. Let's skip that first paragraph, and if you can just start reading there at the top of page 2.
Quoting, "This pandemic has provided an opportunity for a reset. This is our chance to accelerate our pre-pandemic efforts to reimagine economic systems that actually address global challenges like extreme poverty, inequality, and climate change, close quote, Trudeau said.
So there, the pandemic has provided an opportunity for reset. These aren't my words.
No.
These aren't even the words of the New American or Summit News. This is what Trudeau actually said. And it's the perfect opportunity for a reset and getting rid of global challenges like what? Inequality. What's he arguing for here? Obviously, redistribution of the wealth. And he starts talking about the last 6 months as the perfect pretext for this. Can you continue?
Yes, quoting, the last 6 months have laid bare fundamental gaps and inequities within our societies and between them. As with climate change, those who have the least are impacted the most, close quote, Trudeau claimed. Quoting again, that's why last spring, Canada worked with Prime Minister Andrew Holness, from Jamaica, I guess, and Secretary General Antonio Guterres to convene a high-level meeting to discuss how leaders around the world could work together to close these gaps and build a better, more equitable system that works for everyone, close quote. Quoting again, the most promising ideas will be taken up within existing IMF and World Bank processes, as well as at the G7 and G20 Leaders Summits later this fall, or in the fall, close quote. Trudeau said, quoting, because we understand that right now we have to fix urgent problems, but in the long run, we also have to fix the system so that it works for everyone, close quote.
Yeah, so there it is, the last 6 months. That's the pandemic or plandemic.
Yes.
We've got to get rid of any inequities. In other words, global redistribution of wealth. The world could work together to close the gaps and build a better society. This is what they're calling a reimagined society. And everything's got to be involved, including the IMF, the World Bank, the G7, the G20, etc. Of course, Prince Charles is reading off this same song sheet, as is an individual that I think should become a household name. Everybody should know who this person is. His name is Klaus Schwab. And Klaus Schwab, in an article from Summit News, written by Paul Joseph Watson, November 16th, 2020, is talking the same language. The title of the article is Klaus Schwab, Great Reset Will Lead to a Fusion of Our Physical, Digital, and Biological Identity.
Whoa.
Implantable microchips that can read your thoughts. That's what this is all about. It's about a vaccination, which will be mandatory, which will fuse together one's biological identity, physical identity, and digital identity, I would assume through some kind of microchip or electronic tattoo type technology, with the advent of AI, artificial intelligence, where it's not you calling the shots anymore. It's AI telling you what to think and reading your thoughts. And if people think this is just far-fetched, they don't really understand the straitjacket that the world now is being forced into. And they don't understand why Donald Trump has to be taken out of the way. Because Donald Trump is a nationalist to a large extent and not a globalist. What does that article say?
Well, before I read this,
Please.
folks, trust me, you're not going to believe what I'm going to read here. I mean, as I read this article, I used to go to the movies to see this stuff. Now they're talking about it as a reality. Here's the article. Globalist Klaus Schwab made it clear that transhumanism is an integral part of the Great Reset when he said that the fourth industrial revolution would, quote, lead to a fusion of our physical, digital, and biological identity, close quote, which in his book he clarifies is implantable microchips, wait for it, that can read your thoughts.
Wow.
Quoting again, what the fourth industrial revolution will lead to is a fusion of our physical, digital, and biological identity, close quote. Schwab told the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Why don't we just skip down to the next paragraph in
All
the
right.
book?
In the book, Schwab explains with excitement how upcoming technology will allow authorities to, quote, intrude into the hitherto private space of our minds, reading our thoughts and influencing our behavior, close quote. He goes on to predict that this will provide an incentive for law enforcement to implement, watch this, minority report style pre-crime programs. If you haven't seen the movie Minority Report, you don't understand what he just said
Yeah,
there.
and let me just stop for a minute there. You know, Hollywood often telegraphs long in advance,
Yeah.
you know, what the true agenda is. And Minority Report was that Tom Cruise.
Yep, that was Tom Cruise.
And it deals with arrests that were made, and the poor guy says, well, I haven't committed the crime.
Right.
I haven't done anything wrong. Well, we knew what you were going to do.
Exactly.
Because of computer programs.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the things that this Klaus Schwab is talking about.
Yeah.
Please continue.
All right, quoting, as capabilities in this area improve, the temptation for law enforcement agencies and courts to use techniques to determine the likelihood of criminal activity, assess guilt, or even possibly retrieve memories directly from people's brains will increase, close quote, writes Schwab. And quoting again, even crossing a national border might one day involve a detailed brain scan to assess an individual's security risk, close quote.
And if you could just skip that sentence that says we're all going to be cyborgs.
Yeah.
We know what that means.
Yes.
And go on to the fourth industrial revolution.
All right, quoting.
That's what they're calling this.
Yes.
The globalists are calling this the fourth industrial revolution.
Yes. So quoting, the fourth industrial revolution technologies will not stop at becoming part of the physical world around us. They will become part of us, close quote, writes Schwab. Quoting again, indeed, some of us already feel that our smartphones have become an extension of ourselves. Today's external devices, from wearable computers to virtual reality headsets, will almost certainly become implantable in our bodies and brains, close quote. Schwab also openly endorses something the media still claims is solely a domain of discussion for conspiracy theorists, namely, quote, active implantable microchips that break the skin barrier of our bodies, close quote. The globalist hails the arrival of, quote, implanted devices that will likely also help to communicate thoughts normally expressed verbally through a, quote, built-in smartphone and potentially unexpressed thoughts. Ooh, watch this now. Unexpressed thoughts or moods by reading brain waves and other signals, close quote. So in other words, the, quote, fusion of our physical, digital, and biological identity, close quote, relates to the transhumanist singularity and a future where people have their every moment tracked and every thought read by an implantable microchip. And the article ends with this comment, it isn't a conspiracy theory when they're openly telling you what they want to do.
Yeah, that's how everybody wants to dismiss this. It's a conspiracy. But this article is quoting directly from Schwab, and it's quoting from his book.
Yeah.
And
he's serious.
Kind of like Adolf Hitler, who wrote a book called Mein Kampf, and
yeah.
no one took that seriously until it was
exactly,
too late. But this fusion of our physical, digital, and biological identity, harmonizing with this vaccine that apparently we all need due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this is the brave new world that we're being pushed into through Schwab, Trudeau, and the WEF, the World Economic Forum.
Wouldn't this, if let's just presume for a minute that there's validity to this, that this may happen at some point in time, wouldn't you see that as kind of a stepping stone to the image that Revelation talks about?
Absolutely. In fact, look
Isn't
at
that fascinating.
Now that stone or that image is in Revelation 13, verse 15. But that verse is followed by verses 16 through 18, which are verses that are so familiar to us. It's hard to think that we would second guess this is coming. It's like God said it would happen,
Right.
and now it's here. And of course, those are the famous verses where no one can buy or sell unless they receive a mark upon, sort of like what Schwab and company are advocating here, upon the right hand or on the forehead. So this is the global straitjacket that we are being forced into as I currently speak. Yeah. And now, with that as a background, now you start understanding the issue of voter fraud. Because there's something wrong with these machines. And as we'll show in just a moment, these machines are connected to George Soros. Not conspiracy talk. This is actual fact.
Yes.
Because apparently, according to the globalists, Donald Trump, with his nationalistic build a wall around America mindset, is in the way of all of this.
Right.
So Trump has to be removed from power. And that is why what is happening right now in the United States of America is a narrative war.
Yeah.
One side says Trump is a sore loser, he lost, move on, the election results are reliable, and yet there's this minority of people. There's this extremely bold and brave Trump legal team. In fact, we were driving home from the radio station last night after doing the radio show, and you had asked me if I had watched the Trump legal team give their press conference. And I said I hadn't. And you told me, well, you really need to watch that.
Yeah.
Even if you have to stay up. So I stayed up till 1 a.m. And I watched the whole thing. It goes an hour and a half. I watched it from stem to stern.
Yep.
And let me tell you something. When you watch the Trump legal team say what they want to say without being filtered, because most people don't have time for an hour and a half presentation, because we get all of our data or information through filters. When you actually hear what they're saying, you get a completely different perspective.
That's right.
And everybody's dogpiling on them. Well, they don't have any evidence. They don't have any evidence. Well, that's nonsense.
Yep.
And the Trump legal team, I thought, was very clear that, look, we're here just to make an opening statement. This is our kind of opening argument, but the lawsuits are coming.
Right.
And all they had to present was, do they have enough to go forward?
Right.
Based on what they currently have, they have enough to overturn this whole election.
Right.
Now, God willing, if this goes, these lawsuits start moving and they move into discovery phase, where now we have court orders in place, allowing the Trump legal team to legally inspect what the Democrats were hiding by making poll observers stand a football field away. God only knows what they're going to discover.
Right.
And what is going to be discovered, I believe, is an election that is so rife and ripe with corruption that anybody of goodwill, anybody of conscience will argue that the whole thing needs to be overturned.
Right.
And Trump won by a landslide. And he probably had 400 electoral votes is probably what happened. And that's what they're hiding. They don't want this process to go forward.
Right. And
so that's why we're in a narrative war right now.
Yeah.
That's why Facebook and Twitter are putting all their little goofy comments. This has been debunked. This has been fact-checked by independent fact-checkers. Right. This is why the media is against the Trump legal team. This is why you won't get a proper interpretation of what is happening until you actually listen to the Trump legal team make their opening argument. Because they don't want America to believe the narrative as espoused by the Trump legal team. They want you to believe their narrative. Because they're trying to get Donald Trump out of the way through a fraudulent election. And the reason they're trying to get him out of the way is they want to push through with this globalist agenda, which is right there in the writings and the works and the public proclamations of Schwab and Trudeau, and anybody has the intellectual integrity to actually look at those pronouncements and see what's happening. So what would you add to that?
The only thing I would add is, and unfortunately, there are enough useful idiots out there who are they're no better than the lemmings, and they're willing to have someone tell them what to think.
Yes.
And that's part of the problem.
Yeah. And folks, we would encourage you not to let that happen. Do primary source research.
Absolutely.
meaning don't interpret the Trump legal team through your favorite news channel.
Exactly.
Go and pull it up on the internet. It's easy to find. And watch the thing and see if not what they're saying is accurate. Because I was pretty much in their corner before I saw their opening argument or the opening presentation.
Yeah.
Now I'm like 110% in their corner.
I knew you would be.
That's why you had me.
That's why
That's why you told me to watch it.
Yeah.
So that moves us into part 2, which is election theft. And we have this article from the Washington Sentinel, and written by Warner Todd Houston, November 17th, 2020. And it talks about 19 bellwether counties that have always predicted the results of the presidential election, going all the way back to 1980. So, in other words, how these counties voted is how the presidential election ultimately went, going all the way back to 1980 and before. And Trump won 18 of 19 counties.
Yeah.
And here they quote the Wall Street Journal, to communicate their point. And so this, goes to the point that for Trump not to have won this election would be strikingly improbable, if not impossible.
Yeah.
And continuing on, there's something wrong with these voting machines. And we have this article from the Gateway pundit, Jim Hoff, November 17th, 2020, and the title of it is Smartmatic Director Admitted in 2013 their system was able to create at least 1 million phantom votes in that year's Venezuelan election, which brought a communist dictator who destroyed the country.
That's right.
Hugo Chavez to power.
Yep.
That's where these Smartmatic Dominion machines ultimately come from.
Yep.
In other words, they've been used around the world to install communist dictators.
Yeah.
And here, the progenitor of this system admits as much. So what does that article say?
Smartmatic has been stealing elections in Venezuela since at least 2004. In August 2017, Smartmatic director Antonio Mujica admitted that the Smartmatic machines and software created at least 1 million phantom votes in the national elections in Venezuela. Mujica added that the fact election observers were not in the room helped Smartmatic machines steal the election.
Doesn't that sound familiar?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Continuing, this statement by Mujica was in August 2017. The related Dominion equipment is used in North Carolina, Nevada. Let's see if this sounds familiar to you folks.
Yeah, these are all the swing states.
Yeah, North Carolina, Nevada, Georgia, Michigan, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, key battleground states this year. According to Town Hall, the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, issued a statement last week defending the integrity of the 2020 election. The problem, however, is, catch this now, two of the main election software companies that have been called into question, Dominion Voting Systems and Smartmatic, sit on the Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, it is interesting. Now, here's this Smartmatic director admitting that this is what threw the election towards Hugo Chavez.
Yeah.
In fact, the whole scenario where the voting stops in the, as you approach midnight,
Right.
because your candidate is not picking up the speed that you think he needs to pick up, and it's adjusted in the wee hours of the morning. Anybody that's lived through that in Venezuela, the hair on the back of their head would stand up.
Oh, yeah.
Because the exact same thing happened the late evening of November 3rd, early morning of November 4th of this year when we voted here in the United States of America. Now, what happens is when you begin to espouse this, Facebook, Twitter, to some extent YouTube, and they'll probably do it to us, they put up these little, I don't know what you call them, tags, and they'll say, well, the election was completely safe or protected and reliable. And who are they quoting when they do that? Well, the election has been protected by Homeland Security's Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, C-I-S-A. And you say, well, that's great, until you learn that two of the main election software companies that have been called into question, Dominion Voting Systems and Smartmatic, sit on CISA.
You can't make this stuff up.
What's the proverbial saying that's like the hen house?
The fox in the hen house?
The fox guarding the hen house.
Yeah, fox guarding
that's what you have with CISA.
Yeah.
And so when you read this on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, the election is reliable, they're relying on CISA. And yet the leaders of CISA constitute people who are influential in these voting machine companies that we use. Now, here in my stack of stuff, I've got something from The Hill. And this is what it says. Quote, heading into 2020, we're exploring all possible ways that we can support state and local election officials while also ensuring that Americans across the country can confidently cast their votes. CISA Director Christopher Krebs said in a statement. Now, Christopher Krebs, my understanding is he's just been fired, praise God, by Donald Trump. But Krebs comes out and says, oh, the election's reliable and you can trust us, CISA. We guaranteed the reliability of the election. And then The Hill goes on and it says something very interesting here. The Department of Homeland Security Cyber Security Agency announced Thursday it would be a partner with the election officials and private sector groups to develop an election auditing tool that can be used to help ensure the accuracy of votes in 2020. DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, is partnering with the nonprofit group Voting Works. Voting Works on an open software tool known as Arlo, which is provided to state and local election officials for free. So CISA says, trust us, we're going to guarantee that the election is reliable. Oh, and by the way, did I mention that we are partnering with a nonprofit group called Voting Works? Now your average American reads that and says, okay, praise God. We've got free and fair elections in the United States until you do a little background work on Voting Works.
And now for the rest of the story.
So here from Voting Works, nonprofit group, this is what the second paragraph there says. Voting Works, that CISA is relying on, was created within and incubated by the left-leaning Center for Democracy and Technology, CDT.
Oh my gosh.
Interesting. So Voting Works is in bed with CDT. CDT's donors include large left-of-center foundations, including, here we go,
Here it is.
George Soros's
There you go.
foundation to promote an open society, the Ford Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation. So here is the way the chain works. You've got George Soros influencing CDT, CDT influencing Voting Works, Voting Works influencing CISA, and CISA is the standard that Krebs is relying upon to guarantee that our voting is free and fair in the United States of America. Oh, that's why you guys started off with the Great Global Reset. Because of this globalist agenda that obviously George Soros is complicit in.
Oh,
He
yeah.
wants to get rid of Donald Trump. And so when you follow the chain, he's the one that's tampering with these voting devices or machines, which, by the way, have been used around the world in communist countries to install even despicable, diabolical, wicked communist leaders like Hugo Chavez.
That's right.
And that's why I began by saying, Brother Jim, we are in the middle of a communist revolution in the United States of America. This is far beyond dead people voting.
Yes, indeed.
The dead people voting is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. When you get into these machines, that's where the issue really is. And that's how they're throwing and they're stealing the election. That's why they don't want these lawsuits to go forward. Because as these lawsuits go forward, you start entering into the discovery process,
Right.
where everything that's shrouded is now brought into the open
Yeah.
by the Trump investigators. And God knows, Brother Jim, what we're going to discover once that goes
Well,
forward.
that's the truth.
So what they're trying to sell us on now is nothing to see here, folks.
Yep.
Move right along. Trump is just a sore loser.
Yeah.
And it's much bigger than that. It's much bigger than Trump. It has to do with the globalist versus the nationalist agenda. So, and feel free to chime in. What am I missing?
I don't think you're missing anything. The thing that's fascinating me about this is all this information's out there on the internet.
Yeah, if people like
It's
us,
available.
if people like us can research it and figure it out, certainly CNN could if they wanted to,
Or Fox.
or Fox News could. Now, one of the heroes in this whole thing is Sidney Powell. She was one of the spokespersons in the Trump legal team. And here's an article from the end of theamericandream.com, November 16th, 2020, by Michael Snyder. And it's 12 quotes from attorney Sidney Powell that show why Trump's lawyers are absolutely convinced that he will win the election. I wish we had time to read all 12 quotes, but can you read what she says there on quote number 5?
All right, quote number 5, she says, "They can watch the voting real time. They can run a computer algorithm on it as needed to either flip votes, take votes out, or alter the votes to make a candidate win. It's massive criminal voter fraud, writ large across at least 29 states. It's obvious the algorithm and the statistics that our experts are tracking out are batches of votes, and when the votes changed, it's going to blow the mind of everyone in this country when we can get it all together and can explain it with the affidavits and the experts that have come forward." Close quote.
Yeah. Now, I would encourage people to go online and to watch the statement of this individual that we mentioned a little earlier, Antonio, if I'm pronouncing this right. How do you pronounce that? Mojica. And how they use these machines to steal the election in Venezuela in favor of Hugo Chavez. Here is the Twitter feed of Tracy L. Connors, and she's got the video there on her Twitter feed, and she writes, "What are the odds that the CEO of Smartmatic admitted in a press conference in 2017 that their system allowed someone to create 1 million phantom votes in a Venezuelan election?" She writes 100%. So they've done this before. They've created votes out of thin air, and they just did it to you, Mr. and Mrs. America, on November the 3rd and in the wee hours of the morning on November the 4th. So with all of that said, Sidney Powell being in the fight, being on the Trump legal team, being General Flynn's personal lawyer, as we've explained in prior shows, she is on with Lou Dobbs in an 8-minute clip, and she explains it much better than I could or we could. So let's run that clip. It runs about 8 minutes, and then we'll come back and make some comments on it.
Joining us now by phone, Sidney Powell, a member of President Trump's legal team. She is also General Michael Flynn's attorney, former federal prosecutor, best-selling author, one of the country's most prominent appellate attorneys. Sidney, good to have you with us. Dominion voting system seems to be figuring larger and larger in the interest of your legal team. And what is the latest?
Oh, definitely, Lou. I've just gotten some stunning evidence from a firsthand witness, a high-ranking military officer who was present when Smartmatic was designed in a way that and I'm going to just read you some of these statements, if you don't mind, so I get them exactly
Surely.
right from the affidavit. Designed in a way that the system could change the vote of each voter without being detected. He wanted the software itself to function in such a manner that if the voter were to place their thumbprint or fingerprint on a scanner, then the thumbprint would be tied to a record of the voter's name and identity as having voted, but that voter would not be tracked to the changed vote. He made it clear that the system would have to be set up but not leave any evidence of the changed vote for a specific voter, and that there would be no evidence to show and nothing to contradict that the name or the fingerprint or thumbprint was going with a changed vote. Smartmatic agreed to create such a system and produce the software and hardware that accomplished the result for President Chavez. After the Smartmatic electoral management system was put in place, he closely observed several elections where the results were manipulated using the Smartmatic software. One such election was December 2006 when Chavez was running against Rosales. Chavez won with a landslide over Rosales, a margin of nearly 6 million votes for Chavez versus 3.7 million for Rosales. In 2013, he witnessed another Venezuelan national election where the Smartmatic management system was used to manipulate and change the results for Chavez. And it goes on and on. He was in the control room where multiple digital display screens were shown for results and voting. The actual voting results were fed into that room and onto the displays over an internet feed, which was connected to a sophisticated computer system created by Smartmatic. People in that room were able to see in real time whether the vote that came through the electronic voting system was in their favor or against them. If one looked at any particular screen, they could determine that the vote from any specific area or as a national total was going to be against either candidate. Persons controlling the vote tabulation computer had the ability to change the reporting of votes by moving votes from one candidate to another by using the Smartmatic software.
And Smartmatic, the relation...
Smartmatic,
Sidney, yes, and Smartmatic, the chairman is Admiral Pete Neffinger, who is also on the the vice president's transition team, his presumptuous presidential transition team. That's an extraordinary situation as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So here's the other kicker. When the Smartmatic machines when somebody's losing, like, for example, when Maduro and his supporters realized the size of the other guy's lead, they were worried that they were in crisis mode and would lose the election. The Smartmatic machines used for voting in each state were connected to the Internet, reported their information over the Internet to the Caracas Control Center real time, so the decision was made to reset the entire system. Maduro's and his supporters ordered the network controllers to take the Internet itself offline in practically all parts in Venezuela to change the results. It took the voting operators approximately 2 hours to make the adjustments in the vote from Radonsky to Maduro. Then when they turned the Internet back on and the online reporting was up and running again, they checked each screen state by state to be certain they could see each vote was changed in favor of Maduro.
Sidney, you tweeted earlier today about CIA and its association. What have you discovered there?
Well, other than the fact there's no way all this was happening around the world without the CIA knowing about it. I mean, that's just logic. This affidavit also explains it's been used to change election results all over the world. And it's all Venezuelan and Cuban and essentially communist money that's been doing this. It's a foreign-owned company, as you mentioned earlier. The president of it is Mr. Neffinger, who is on Biden's very presumptuous and immediately failing transition team. And people have been reporting this to our government for several years, including Democrats, and nobody's done a damn thing about it, Lou. I can't even express how furious I am over this.
Well, I share your fury and frustration, but I do have some news to break here at this moment. I have now received word from a highly reliable source that the FBI does have an investigative team that is now looking into this election. Now, what that means beyond that, but at least it's confirmation that they are investigating, and we'll see what moves, because there had been no indication that indeed publicly that they were involved. They are now. To that point, I'd just like to show, if we could put up the full screen, under what their authorities are when we talk about these state-run elections, even though they're federal elections for at least a sizable number of the candidates. As you see there, the ballot includes one or more federal candidates, an election, a polling place, official abuses of their office, the conduct involving false voter registration, the crime intentionally targets minority protected classes, the activity violates federal campaign finance laws. All of this laid out on the FBI website for anyone to look at. And it appears, Sidney, that at least the FBI has finally looked at that website. I'm not sure it was Christopher Wray, but someone at the FBI, and took action. Your thoughts?
Well, my other thought is that as soon as the Smartmatic system changed the votes that they wanted for their desired candidate, by the time they finish, they achieve a convincing but narrow victory of the certain number of votes they want for their candidate. This person saw by what his own experience exactly what was happening there was happening here.
It is a deeply troubling election. As I said earlier, the worst in this country's history, bar none. And we have seen official investigative and Justice Department officials slow to move, and it is infuriating to everyone.
No, we've seen willful blindness. They have adopted a position of willful blindness to this massive corruption across the country. And the Smartmatic software is in the DNA of every vote tabulating company's software and system.
Yes, and it is more than just a willful blindness. This is people trying to blind us to what is going on. We don't even know who the hell really owns these companies, at least most of them. That's got to change, and we've got to find out exactly what's going on. And thank God we've got a president who will stay in the fight all the way through until we get those answers. Sidney Powell, thanks so much. We appreciate it as always. Thanks so much. We appreciate it as always.
So, you know, Brother Jim, the reality of the situation is beyond everything else that was discussed. I personally, and I think Mr. and Mrs. America out there, are shocked to learn that when they go and vote, their vote goes to a foreign country to be counted and tabulated.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that problematic in and of itself? I mean, how did we ever get so foolish as to buy in, you know, to that kind of a system, and then to use machines that have this tainted background with Venezuela and propping up communist dictators,
Knowingly using them.
Yes, and so what? I mean, something needs to happen drastically in this country to see us continue as a free and independent nation. I saw you making some notes over there. What do you say about this?
I just was writing down as I was listening. I hadn't heard that before. That this was a high-ranking military officer. You know, you don't get any higher in the Navy than an admiral. And this guy is the one that she's saying is providing all this information. Well, why is no one listening to him?
Yeah.
You know, that's surprising.
And why is this not common knowledge?
Why? Absolutely. Absolutely. This didn't just happen overnight.
No. And what's interesting is I think, Brother Jim, the people out there instinctively know what was wrong. There was a gathering that took place, I think it was on a Saturday, recent Saturday, November the 14th, and we have a picture, an aerial picture of the crowd standing in support of the President of the United States. 72 million people in this last election
Yeah.
that we know of.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
maybe there were more,
Right.
voted for President Trump. And this is the kind of gathering I recall from the Tea Party movement.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is not the Republican Party establishment that's putting this together. This is a grassroots
Yes.
response, serendipitously arising, spontaneously arising from the
Yes,
people of the
exactly.
United States, because the people of the United States, we the people, are ticked off.
Mm-hmm.
We the people instinctively know that something is wrong here.
Right.
And we don't want the America that Justin Trudeau wants us to have,
Yeah.
or Schwab wants us to have, or George Soros wants to have. We want our votes to count.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe Hollywood's not on our side, the media is not on our side, the establishment of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are not on our side, but the people
Mm-hmm.
are behind Donald Trump.
Yes.
And here is actually a screenshot from Melissa Tate, and you can go onto her Twitter feed and actually see this crowd, a recording of it. And it's one thing to look at a picture, it's another thing to hear the voices of the people.
Yes.
You know, shouting out. And she writes here, one of my favorite Jefferson quotes, "Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." And so, my goodness, Brother Jim, this global reset has reached so far into the fabric of our cultures that it's on the precipice of stealing an election.
Yeah.
Now, something else is happening, Brother Jim, and this has to do with attacks on the United States Constitution. And you'll remember Alan Dershowitz, we have a picture of him there, said this. This comes from WorldNet Daily, and I think we covered this on Pastor's Point of View number 124. And he said this, quote, and this is from an article from Art Moore, May 18th, 2020, WorldNet Daily. Alan Dershowitz says, "The state has the right to plunge a needle into your arm. Contends Constitution grants government power to forcibly vaccinate individuals." And this is the kind of brazen, blatant constitutional attack that's taking place, which is our third category here, attacks on the United States Constitution. And they're all quoting this Jacobson case, which supposedly gives the state this right to forcibly vaccinate us. Have they told you that the Jacobson case is a 1905 case?
Yeah.
So they sure are relying upon an old case, and times have certainly changed. But you'll notice that Dershowitz says exactly what the New York Bar Association says. We have it quoted here. The New York State Bar Association President, Scott M. Carson, he's basically reiterating what Dershowitz said. And this comes from an article entitled "Why a Mandatory COVID Vaccination is Unconstitutional" by Jonathan Clark, November 16th, 2020, and this is from the American Thinker. And I wanted to make people aware of this article because what Dershowitz says is wrong.
Yes.
The Jacobson case, this 1905 case that apparently Dershowitz believes gives the state the right to plunge a needle into your arm against your will. That's not what the Jacobson case says. And the American Thinker article points this out. Would you mind reading that? Why don't you pick it up here? There is no question on page 7.
All right, quoting, "There is no question that a mandatory COVID-19 vaccination law would conflict violently with the U.S. Constitution. The New York Bar Association has committed gross legal malpractice in this declaration. It has misrepresented both the law and the facts. The constitutional law regarding states' use of police powers to protect public health and safety is well established. Any infringement by government of a fundamental right is subject to strict scrutiny, which chiefly incorporates two concepts: that in such cases, the government's interest must be compelling what the New York Bar refers to as necessary, and it must be accomplished by the least restrictive means. Quoting again, under the standard, the court presumes the policy to be invalid unless the government can demonstrate a compelling interest to justify the policy. Further, this test applies even when the government has a legitimate purpose in adopting the particular law, close quote. There's no question that restricting travel, assembly, or speech impacts a fundamental constitutional liberty. How deadly is COVID-19? COVID-19 occupies a relatively innocuous position on that spectrum of deadly scourges, and the rates of mortality are declining. That is, the medical evidence falls far short of surmounting that legal standard of strict scrutiny required by the United States Constitution. The seminal case on the constitutionality of forced government vaccinations is Jacobson versus Massachusetts, a 1905 U.S. Supreme Court decision that affirmed Massachusetts' authority to impose mandatory smallpox vaccinations. Yet, Jacobson does not answer today's COVID vax question. Smallpox was unquestionably a much deadlier illness. The Jacobson court specifically cited on page 29 yellow fever and Asiatic cholera as comparable diseases, warranting quarantine or other restrictions on personal liberty. Yellow fever has a mortality rate of 15 to 50% of reported cases. Asiatic cholera kills in mere hours with a mortality rate approaching 50%. Smallpox killed 30% of those infected. How would the Jacobson court have evaluated COVID-19, especially if the law imposed a mandatory vaccination without the escape path of paying a fine? COVID-19 does not rise to that level of medical necessity required by existing American law for a person's rights and body to be violated by government in the name of protection of health. Current studies reveal that it is primarily the very elderly who are at risk and should be protected. The infection fatality rate is lowest in people 5 to 9 years of age. That's 0.001%, increasing to 0.1% among those 25 to 29 years of age, almost 1% among those 60 to 64 years of age, and is highest amongst those 80 years and older at 8.4%. Will the New York Bar mandate vaccinations for children who face a 0.001% mortality rate to protect the small minority of citizens who face an 8.4% risk of death? That would seem to turn Jacobson on its head. And remember, those rates of COVID death are dropping. The standardized mortality ratio dropped from 1.26 95% CI 1.15 to 1.39 in March to 0.38, which is 95% CI 0.12 to 0.88 in August, at which time the average probability of death, that's the average marginal effect, was 18.2 percentage points lower than in March. COVID is now rampant, increasing herd immunity well ahead of a government-imposed pharmaceutical rescue. It is also less deadly and a very far cry from the menaces of Ebola, yellow fever, smallpox, or cholera that would justify government power to forcibly stick a needle in a child's arm.
So that's a tremendous article because what is happening with Alan Dershowitz and what is happening with the New York Bar Association as they are prepping us for this global vaccination is they're setting aside the Constitution.
Right.
And they're relying upon this 1905 case Jacobson. And even if you rely on that, the constitutional obligation that the state has to show for forcible vaccination is not met.
Right.
The legal standard is they have to show a compelling interest, compelling state interest, which is the highest threshold the state must meet, and they have to show that they pursued that interest through the least restrictive means possible. So is this a compelling interest? Yes. They have to show it because a mandatory vaccination would restrict travel, assembly, speech, because you can't do any of those things. You can't travel unless you have this vaccination. And you'll notice that the court specifically mentioned in 1905 yellow fever, Asiatic cholera, if I'm pronouncing that right. Cholera, excuse me. And those diseases had a mortality rate of 15 to 50%. Yeah, the yellow fever actually had a rate of 15 to 50%, and it also mentions here smallpox, and then it mentions cholera kills in mere hours with a mortality rate approaching 50%, and smallpox killed 30% of those infected. Now let's compare that to COVID-19. Current studies reveal that it is primarily the very elderly who are at risk. If you're age 5 to 9, your risk of dying from COVID is 0.001%. Sure is much smaller than the other diseases that the court was dealing with back in 1905. If you're from age 25 to 29, you've got a 0.1% chance of dying. The highest mortality rate is those around age 80, and their mortality rate is 8.4%. Notice how much smaller that is than the 50%, 30% numbers that the court was dealing with in 1908. This is what Alan Dershowitz and the New York Bar Association are not telling you. Beyond that, COVID rates are dropping as we speak from 1.26% in March to 0.38% in August. And so the article concludes by saying it's a very far cry from the menace of Ebola, yellow fever, smallpox, or how do you pronounce that? Cholera. So the point is the Jacobson case, based on its facts, has a totally different result, totally different circumstance than what we're facing today with COVID-19. So no, Alan, I'm sorry, the state does not have a unilateral right to plunge a needle into your arm. No, New York Bar Association, you're misreading the facts and the law. And I like how this particular article begins. It says the New York Bar Association has committed gross legal malpractice in this declaration. It has misrepresented both the facts and the law.
And I'm holding this picture up again because the only thing I want to add to this is it's people like this gentleman right here that know that the majority of Americans will never research this out to determine if what he's saying is true.
That's exactly right.
So see, he just uses us as useful idiots, right?
That's exactly right. Now, continuing on with these constitutional attacks, Justice Alito spoke recently to the Federalist Society. And here we have an article from Fox News by Bree Stimson, November the 12th. The title of it is Justice Alito Warns of the Dangers to Free Speech, Religious Liberty in a Federalist Society Address. Quote, in certain quarters, religious liberty has fast becoming a disfavored right, close quote, Alito said. And now let me just read to you. It's almost like this guy has, I don't know, like Clark Kent, pulled back his layman's clothes, and he's got Superman there underneath, because this guy has turned out to be a real hero.
Yes, I agree.
And he is aggressively standing for the United States Constitution in the midst of all of these attacks that we have been discussing from his position on the United States Supreme Court. He says in that speech, tolerance for opposing views is now in short supply. He talks about the crisis in the nation's law schools. He says more recent law school graduates claim they face harassment and retaliation for any views that depart from law school orthodoxy, Alito said. Now, I'm a graduate of an ABA-approved law school, and I can tell you that was categorically the case 25 years ago. I can't imagine how much worse it's become today. He goes on and he says, in certain quarters, religious liberty is fast becoming a disfavored right. Religious liberty, in other words, we don't want to hire a cross-dresser here at Sugarland Bible Church. That's portrayed as just an excuse for bigotry. And he mentions the Little Sisters of the Poor, who are forced to provide abortion coverage, even though they're Roman Catholic. He mentions the Colorado baker, I think his name is Jack Stevens, who against his Christian convictions was forced to make a same-sex wedding cake. And he talks about how this pandemic has resulted in previously unimaginable restrictions on individual liberty. And he mentions that Nevada was unable to provide any justification for treating casinos more favorably than houses of worship.
Unbelievable.
And he talks about religious liberty is in danger of becoming a second-class right. And then he says this, and this is all a sitting Supreme Court justice saying all of these things. That's why I'm mentioning this in our third category here, attacks on the U.S. Constitution. He says you can't say that marriage is a union between one man and one woman, Alito said. Until very recently, that's what the vast majority of Americans thought. That's even what the Democratic Party stood for. Now it's considered bigotry. Now, he mentions this casinos, and he says Nevada was unable to provide any justification for treating casinos more favorably than houses of worship. And he's speaking of a court case recently decided by the United States Supreme Court where Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote a dissent. Justice Gorsuch's dissent in Calvary Chapel, Dayton Valley v. Steve Sisolak, governor of Nevada. And what did Gorsuch say in that particular dissent?
Quoting, in Nevada, it seems it is better to be in entertainment than religion. Maybe that is nothing new. But the First Amendment prohibits such obvious discrimination against the exercise of religion. The world we inhabit today, with a pandemic upon us, poses unusual challenges. But there is no world in which the Constitution permits Nevada to favor Caesar's Palace over Calvary Chapel, close quote.
So it's interesting, they imposed all of these, social distancing requirements. If the social distancing requirement is not met, then you can't open. And they imposed that on a Calvary Chapel church there, I guess in Nevada. And the Calvary Chapel church says, well, why is it okay to go gamble at Caesar's Palace? And the governor is being unfair in discriminating against Calvary Chapel, but allowing Caesar's Palace to go forward. The United States Supreme Court sides with the governor. They don't side with Calvary Chapel. And Neil Gorsuch in a dissent says, in a classic line, but there is no world in which the Constitution permits Nevada to favor Caesar's Palace over Calvary Chapel, close quote. And this is what Samuel Alito, in this talk before the Federalist Society, is emphasizing. Here's another article on that same talk. It says, Alito savages Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, accusing him of orchestrating an affront to the Constitution and the rule of law, by Kevin Daly, November the 13th, 2020, from the Free Beacon. And apparently this individual, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, called for, quote, a restructuring of the court. And he did this in response to the court's pro-gun ruling. Alito called the idea, quote, an affront to the Constitution and the rule of law. Alito goes on in this talk and he says the Second Amendment is the ultimate second-tier constitutional right. I mean, if you don't have a Second Amendment, how do you protect the rest of the rights in the Bill of Rights? And I like this line here. Would you mind reading this? Take a quick look.
All right, quoting, take a quick look at the Constitution, Alito said. You will see the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, which protects religious liberty. You will not find a craps clause or a blackjack clause or a slot machine clause, close quote. The justice was referring to a Nevada law that gave the green light for casinos to open, but capped church attendance.
Yeah, so church limited, Caesar's Palace opened. Alito says, I don't see a blackjack clause in the United States Constitution or a craps clause, but I do see the First Amendment protections of religious liberty.
Yeah.
And this is how your Constitution is being assaulted today.
Yeah.
In all of these different venues, preparing us for the New World Order of the future. And it's not me calling attention to it. It's a sitting Supreme Court justice calling attention to it. This article goes on and it says White House, that's the senator, and his colleagues said that a pro-gun ruling would further incite the growing movement to restructure the court. The liberals are saying, if you don't rule the way we want on the Second Amendment, meaning there is no Second Amendment, we're going to pack the court.
Yeah.
And Alito responded and said the senator's brief was extraordinary. Alito added, I could say something about the standards of professional conduct, but the brief involved something even more important. It was an affront to the Constitution and to the rule of law. And what is being promoted today, Brother Jim, is the idea, or at least we're forgetting the idea, that our rights come from God.
Amen.
They don't come from the United States Supreme Court. They don't come from Senator so-and-so. They don't come from Trudeau. They don't come from Schwab. They don't come from Bill Gates. They come from God.
Amen.
And that's what our founding documents say. As you can see in this slide, the Declaration of Independence, the laws of nature and nature's God. We are all created equal, endowed with certain inalienable or unalienable rights. And these people, and Alito is bringing this out, think they can just wave a magic wand and the First Amendment is going to disappear. And the Second Amendment is going to disappear. And they're using COVID-19 as a pretext for all of this. And we've lost sight, have we not, of our founding documents. Here also is something that people need to be aware of concerning this assault on the Constitution. This is from Breitbart.com, and the title of it is Biden Appoints Anti-Free Speech Richard Stengel to Transition Team Media Post. So who is going to be governing free speech, social media under the Biden administration? The guy that's going to be in charge of it is this gentleman by the name of Richard Stengel. And this guy, Richard Stengel, has a paper trail where it's quite apparent as you read his work that I don't think he agrees with the First Amendment based on some of the things he says. Would you mind reading, starting with this quote here? Stengel argued.
All right. Stengel argued, quoting, a government official traveling around the world championing the virtues of free speech, I came to see how our First Amendment standard is an outlier. All speech is not equal. And where truth cannot drive out lies, we must add new guardrails. I'm all for protecting thought that we hate, but not speech that incites hate, close quote.
Now, this is from his own op-ed piece.
Whew.
And the title of it is Why America Needs a Hate Speech Law. And he says the First Amendment, and this is the guy that's going to be monitoring social media. This is what you're getting in the Biden administration. God forbid if they should assume power. The First Amendment needs guardrails around it. So the days of free speech, I guess, are over. And why don't you read that underlined section in the next paragraph? And these are direct quotes from either his own interviews or his own published writings.
All right, quoting again, the First Amendment doesn't protect false speech about a virus or false speech that endangers the health of your users. And by the way, Facebook and Twitter have been taking things down, but they need to be even more vigilant about it. And Google needs to be even more vigilant about what they prioritize in their search results, close quote.
So Facebook and Twitter, they're already acting like Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, well, that needs to accelerate.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's why conservatives are all leaving Facebook for Parler and MeWe and Rumble and some of these other places. And he says the incursions on free speech that are now happening need to actually accelerate. This is so bad that even Jonathan Turley, a constitutional scholar, speaks up. Now, Jonathan Turley is a Democrat, and even he's alarmed by this. And what does he say?
Well, praise the Lord. Constitutional scholar Jonathan Turley warned about Stengel's appointment in a column Tuesday, quoting, "It would be difficult to select a more anti-free speech figure to address government media policy. One has to assume that Biden will continue the onslaught against this core freedom as president," close quote. He noted that Biden himself had publicly advocated restrictions on speech during the campaign, quoting, "Biden called for greater speech controls on the internet and denounced Twitter for allowing others to speak freely," close quote.
And then we have this article from PJ Media, Robert Spencer, November 14th, 2020. Biden, dealing with the same individual, Stengel. Biden, transition official, believes the First Amendment has a design flaw. I mean, not only does the First Amendment need guardrails, but it has a design flaw. His remedy is to curb free speech. Can you read the quote here again from Stengel?
Quoting, "All speech is not equal, and where truth cannot drive out lies, we must add new guardrails. I'm all for protecting thought that we hate, but not speech that incites hate."
So, yeah, and so what is Stengel's solution? How does he view the First Amendment? Would you mind reading this section down here, beginning with the word yes?
All right, quoting, it says here, "Yes, the First Amendment protects the thought that we hate, but it should not protect hateful speech that can cause violence by one group against another. In an age when everyone has a megaphone, that seems like a design flaw," close quote. Many other nations are fixing that design flaw, according to Stengel, and so the U.S. should also. Still quoting, "Since World War II, many nations have passed laws to curb the incitement of racial and religious hatred. These laws started out as protections against the kinds of anti-Semitic bigotry that gave rise to the Holocaust. We call them hate speech laws, but there's no agreed upon definition of what hate speech actually is. In general, hate speech is speech that attacks and insults people on the basis of race, religion, ethnic origin, and sexual orientation," close quote. Stengel's statement that, quote, "The First Amendment protects the thought that we hate, but it should not protect hateful speech that can cause violence by one group against another," means that if Muslims riot over burned Qurans, we must outlaw burning Qurans. That would only signal to Muslims that they can get us to bend to their will by threatening violence, and ensure that we will see many more such threats. Note also that leftists and Islamic groups in the U.S. have for years insisted, with no pushback from any mainstream politician or media figure, that essentially any and all criticism of Islam, including analysis of how Islamic jihadis use the text and teachings of Islam to justify violence and make recruits among peaceful Muslims, is hate speech and speech that incites hate, close quote.
So according to this gentleman, Stengel, who is about to be elevated into a position of prominence governing all of our speech, at least electronically, he has a new definition of free speech. Speech is free until another side riots against it. So if you critique the theological problems with Islam and the Muslims riot, then you can't theologically critique Islam anymore. By the way, same with homosexuality. You can critique homosexuality from the pulpit until the homosexuals show up at your church and start a riot. Then you don't have free speech anymore to critique homosexuality. So what we're being plummeted into is a brand new definition of free speech that's controlled by the people that are being critiqued. All they have to do is get upset to the point of a riot and your free speech rights disappear. Now that is not our unalienable rights that our founding fathers bequeathed to us at all. So in this particular category, attacks on the United States Constitution, I wanted to show you how the Alan Dershowitz model that the state has a right to plunge a needle into your arm is setting aside the Constitution itself, including the Jacobson case. And how Samuel Alito himself, when he's given the opportunity to speak, is warning against incursions of the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, and how Biden has now put someone in a position that will influence free speech, and he has a definition of free speech that's completely new and that will curb it. And I think all of this, Brother Jim, is setting the stage for the New World Order. This is how our Constitution is being set aside. Well, Brother Jim, I've got so much material here, and I'm looking at my clock, and we've been at this for over an hour. So what I think we're going to do is we're going to stop at this point. If you're good with it, and you could tell me once we go off camera, we're going to come back after about a 10-minute break and complete our list. So at this time, we'll call it on a pause. If you're watching us live, don't disappear on us. We're going to be coming right back in about 15 minutes, Lord willing. So we'll see you then.